Jessica Frost-Ballas here with a new Crafty Quintet video for Simon Says Stamp. Today I'm sharing my 5 favorite tips and tricks for mass-producing cards, just in time for the start of the holiday card making season. First up is my trick for stamping multiple layering stamps. Any stamp position will work for this, but I'm using a MISTI today. I started by lining up the bottom layer of the Hero Arts color layering baby penguin on the bottom half of my MISTI and stamped it on a scrap piece of cardstock. Then I placed the same scrap panel on the top half of my MISTI and lined up the second layer of the penguin. I double checked it to make sure everything was lined up correctly, and then I was ready to start stamping. I placed 2 A2 panels in my MISTI and inked the bottom penguin layer with Hero Arts soft granite ink and the top penguin layer with Hero Arts charcoal ink and stamped them at the same time. Then I simply reversed the panels and stamped the next layer. I do this quite regularly and have never noticed a difference in stamping the bottom layer first or second. I'm only making 2 cards to share today, but for example, if I was stamping 100 holiday cards, this would make a huge difference in the time spent crafting. You'd repeat this step for as many cards as needed and then move on to the next layers. This particular stamp only has 3 layers, but if you had a 4-layer stamp, you'd repeat the process to stamp the next layers. As is, I just needed to line up the outline layer using my scrap panel, and then I stamped my 2 penguins with the outline layer using intense black ink. For this card design, I'm stamping the penguin directly onto the card panel. But if I was die cutting him, I could easily line up the first layers in the space of the same A2 panel, so I only had to rotate the panel to get 2 layers. And then I could have had the 3rd layer set up on the top of my MISTI. There are lots of ways you can be more efficient with your layered stamping. Once I'm done stamping, I stamp the penguin outline onto a stack of full sheet stickiness post-it notes to use as a mask later. My next trick is perfect for all your small shapes and sentiment dies. When you're mass-producing cards, it can take a long time to add liquid adhesive to the back of intricate die-cut shapes. This particular design doesn't really have intricate shapes, but you know what I mean. So I apply a layer of Be Creative double-sided adhesive to the back of a piece of white cardstock. Next, I die-cut the top hat shape as many times as I need it. If I was trying to make many cards, I'd be a little more judicious on where I die-cut the images to get the most out of my adhesive panel, but here I'll just reserve the leftover cardstock for later. Then I place the panel I just used for my die cutting in my MISTI and line up the 2 hat layers in the openings. I use my same scrap panel to test where I place the stamps and adjust them as needed. Once I'm set, I fit the die-cut hats into the opening and stamp each layer using charcoal and intense black ink. Then I switch the die cuts and stamp the second layers. This is a huge time saver when it comes to stamping images you plan to die cut later. If you stamped 100 top hats first, you'd then have to spend the time lining up 100 passes through your die cutting machine. But if you die cut them first, then you just have to fit them into the openings and you have 100 perfect hats. Next, I take the mask I stamped on post-it notes and pull up 3 sticky notes, including the top stamped piece. I fussy cut them, and now I have 3 masks. If you're doing a lot of stamping over a mask, the ink can eventually bleed through a post-it note, so I like to cut a bunch at once so that you've got plenty to work with. And since they're just post-it notes, it's easy to stack even up to 6 or 7 and cut at the same time. I usually don't use the top stamped mask, just because I want to make sure I don't accidentally transfer that black ink to anything. If you're using the mask with stenciling or blending, you could easily drag black ink onto your project unintentionally. I place the masks over my 2 penguins and then place them back in my MISTI. I've arranged a bunch of snowflakes from the Hello Bluebird Holiday Flurries set, and I stamped them with Blue Jay, Fish Tank, Forget Me Not, and Moonstone ink from Fawn. Of course, using a stamp positioner means I can easily restamp if needed to get a crisp image as I do here. Then I remove the masks, but keep them for future use. My last tip involves sentiments. Again, in the interest of saving time, I like to stamp a bunch of sentiments at the same time, and it's easy to use a stamp positioner for this. I line up the sentiment from color layering Baby Penguin towards the top of a panel of Blue Jay cardstock. Then I stamp it with Versamark. Next, I move the panel up 4 grid squares and stamp a second time. I can repeat this process of moving the panel up 4 grid squares until I've filled up the cardstock. If you're stamping with regular dye ink, you can stamp as much as you want. If you're stamping with Versamark and VersaFine for embossing, I'd probably only stamp up to 4 times before moving to the embossing powder, just to make sure your ink doesn't dry too much. After heat embossing the sentiments with white embossing powder, I trimmed them down to thin labels. I adhered the hats to my penguins and then I added the sentiments with foam mounting tape. Off camera, I finished the cards by adding a little crystal glaze and glitter to ground my penguins. And that's it! I'd love to know if you have any tips for mass producing cards. What's the highest number of cards you've made at once? For me, it was 120 cards for a local photographer with full ink-blended backgrounds, and that was something I am likely to never repeat again. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. Have a wonderful day, and until next time, happy crafting. Bye!